the last bit that Nissa was talking about, she started to talk about the new guidebook, Complete Streets Guidebook, which is the companion piece to the Complete Streets policy. And you all should have a copy of this. It's a really good, quick, easy reference. And so part of what we're trying to do with this training is in the guidebook, it talks about a process for defining Complete Streets context. You'll see this table. It's like, I've got a slide with it with like 1 through 4 steps. And Nissa's presentation began that kind of overview of what's in this guidebook. And this presentation is going to dig a little bit deeper into the context categories. And then we'll do the hierarchy tool, which is another new piece later this afternoon. And then the reporting requirements, which is new for many of you tomorrow. So that's kind of where we're going, but that guidebook is a really good reference to have. So with the new Complete Streets guidance, it used to, as Nissa mentioned, it used to be the case that the land use hierarchies were living in a tech memo, which was a addendum to the roadway design manual. And now with the update to the facility design guide, they've gotten some airtime on their own and have their own discussion in the new facility design guide. So this is just published. You can find it. It's live on the public website. So just a little bit of history lesson because we're at class and why not? It's fun on where these land use context types came from. So they're really an evolution of the functional classification system, which is defined when they conceptualized the federal aid system, like back a long time ago. And it really was intended to define the relationship between access and mobility. So you've all seen this, right? You get the principal arterials are supposed to provide a higher degree of mobility, through and all that, where you've got the lower functioning roadways that are providing access to property. And under that original functional classification system, there were only 2 land use categories. Who knows what they are? Oh yeah, it was just urban and rural. So that's why we're here. There's been a recognition with the evolution from context sensitive design into multimodal transportation planning and complete streets that we need to have a little bit more of a nuanced look at it. And so fast forward, 40 years or whatever it's been, the idea of land use context types started to show up. And this is the first good, well thought out example I could find of the land use context categories. And this is the New Jersey Smart Transportation Guidebook. And this defined a series of 7 land use context types. And it started to talk about what those look like in terms of the land use categories and how that connects to transportation. So there was like tables for each of these land use contexts that talked about things like lane widths, design and control vehicles and turning radii and that kind of thing. But it was still pretty complicated, and what you were supposed to do with that was still kind of loosely defined. And then in fast forward to, I think it was early 2017 and into 2018, NCHRP 855 came out, and this was a study that was a research-based study, but it said, we've got the existing functional classification system. There's this new concept of these land use typologies that's emerging. And should the federal government, FHWA, expand our functional classification system? The answer was, the recommendation was yes, and that's in the works now with FHWA. This is the first time that the idea of this transportation hierarchy kind of came up in this type of a guidance document, where you're defining sort of this user multimodal priorities, which is something that we've kind of taken forward into the guidebook for MnDOT, and we'll talk a whole lot about in a little bit. This came out and talked about application of the 9 land use context types. And as part of the development of this document is when they workshopped and sort of defined in Minnesota, we've got these 9, and I'm going to go through them all in that are what we use now and carried forward into the facility design guide. Which is out now. And as I understand it, the new facility design guide, which is going to replace the roadway design manual, will never be complete. They're going to update it a chapter at a time. And it's been going for years, but this chapter's done. So yay, we've got it. And we've got some references now where This used to be, okay, it's in this performance-based practical design guide and in this tech memo, and we can look at it, but we didn't really have it in an official design document, and now we do. We've got the Complete Streets policy that says we will do complete streets. It's statute, it's in the law, it's a requirement that we have to do it. And now finally, we've got some guidance that starts to bring us towards an approach on how it can be implemented. And that's what the rest of this training is about, is what's the process? We don't have a checklist. We don't have a list of elements that, you should incorporate all of these, but instead, is there a thought process that we can start to understand that gets us there? So this is just tying it all together, kind of that evolution or that history from the early functional classification system all the way into where we are today. And it will continue to evolve, as things change over time. So the important bit here, and this is really the hardest part, is, well, okay, I've got 9 land use context categories. I've got a project and I've defined them. Now, who cares? Why did I do that? Why does it matter? And this is really the answer. It's not easy, but what it is understanding, okay, I've got a land use, I've got a context, and that comes with a certain set of activities. People are doing stuff. Think of that San Francisco video. People were milling around in the street. And then our job is to say, well, what does that mean? What do those activities mean from a transportation design perspective? And that's where we can connect it to design. And that's what the facilities design guide is going to do. That's why they're in that chapter 3, is as subsequent chapters are finally finalized and released, there will be specific design guidance tied to those land use category types. So that's kind of where it's all going, is connecting the land use to reflect the actual things that people are doing in that place, and what those activities look like, and drawing a straight line into transportation design. I'm going to go in now to a discussion about what are those 9 land use context types, and how they came about. As I've said, or as Nissa said, we've got 9. This is a graphic that just is an illustration. It's kind of fun, that shows sort of the thinking around how land use context types, industry perspective, are thought about. This is from Peter Duani, Andres Duani, which is part of the new urbanism planning movement. It's like a decade old, but generally moving from rural into more urban, suburban than urban, and then recognizing that there are specialty overlays. There's industry, there's ports, there's all of that kind of thing. And so with all of that in mind, here are the 9 MnDOT land use context types, and just a few caveats. One, as Nissa said, we didn't invent them as part of this, but we have them, and I think they're pretty good. They're not perfect. We're never going to have a project where your context fits perfectly clean within all of these land use context types, right? There's always going to be flexibility. There's always going to be, well, it's got most of the characteristics, but it's a little, and that's where the professional judgment comes in. We have to do the work. I'm gonna go through each of these, but there's one thing that isn't explicitly called out with that we've wrestled with a lot. There's one issue that we hear a lot. Where does the small town Main Street fit in, right? So this is MnDOT. Think of greater Minnesota. Think of all of the small towns across the state, and know that somebody said, what was it? The hallmark effect, the mulberry effect. Think of all those small towns and all those small town main streets that, many people love, we see them out there. That's an MnDOT facility going through that road, through that town most of the time, right? So our MnDOT highway goes through a transition from natural or rural or agriculture, whatever it is, into probably some suburban on the fringes, and then it gets into this small town main street deal. And that is captured. It's not its own category because it fits. We have to do the work. It could be urban, it could be urban commercial, it could be urban residential, or it might be suburban. And there are some definitions behind all that. So this is another slide that just kind of ties it all together. We've got in statute, the functional classification system that gives us urban and rural. AASHTO did a study. They've got 5 land use context category types. And then they take things like industrial areas or ports, and they kind of pull them off to the side, universities, things like that. And then we said, we're MnDOT and we're special, so we're gonna have 9. because we're better. So that's where we're at. And there are some reasons why. So, without, much more, build up, I'm just gonna flip through each of the 9 and give some examples. How are they defined and what are we gonna do with them? The tables on this screen are summarized from the Facility Design Guide, Chapter 3, and these give us the characteristics that make up the definitions. So you've got a description of what it's all about. In this case, natural, sparsely developed or not developed. There's a discussion of what the land use looks like, and then we get into things like building density, setbacks, where's the parking, what does the frontage look like? What types of roadway or transportation facilities are commonly present? This is a baseline. None of our projects are going to fit cleanly within any of these, but they do sort of line up. So that's where we're at. So the first one is natural. Anybody think of an example of a natural context type in Minnesota? What about in this district?
There's a couple of examples that come to mind. There are parts along the North Shore.
Which is this? That's
Yep.
Highway 61, I believe.
There are parts that go through state park areas. There are, the Gunflint Trail comes to mind. I can't think of any examples in D3 off the top of my head, but there might be some. Probably are some. Jim doesn't think so, but there might be a couple.
I'm thinking 84, 87.
Where did those go through?
Bonneville?
Yeah.
Bonneville, up in that area.
We had a project along north of Stillwater, Highway 95, is that what it was? And that kind of jumped through a couple O'Brien State Park areas, so we kind of leapfrogged the natural versus rural.
More common is rural, right? And this is greater Minnesota, agricultural land, right? This is what a lot of the Complete Streets projects that we work on tend to be more urban context, and rural is usually like that transition into it, right? Where we get into it. So the policy does apply to all context types. It does apply to rural, but what you'll see later is the activities that we would expect, and therefore the transportation facilities that we design change a little bit. So rural, we all know what rural is. Trade, agricultural land, all of that kind of stuff. Rural crossroads is a sneaky one. It's probably the hardest one, I think. What rural crossroads in my mind is it's not quite urban. You're driving in a rural area and you get to that county road intersection where there's a gas station and a bar and a church or something like that. It's not quite a town. It looks something like that where there's just this little something, and that's different. That's different than designing for a rural area. You might have some expectation of pedestrian crossings. You might have some bike facilities that connect to a local network.
The one that comes to mind that we did some work on last year in D3 would be Bertram.
What, say that again,
The
Bertram?
town is called Bertram. We kind of struggled with it, and rural crossroads was a designation that it's hard for me to wrap my head around, and I was reluctant to use it. But when you go to the next slide and you read where that is, it was less farming, slightly more commercial. So how to differentiate this between rural and natural, and then there becomes judgment call.
Yeah, I think of a case study in Mora. You go 10 miles past Mora, and there's like some resorts with like a restaurant, like a steakhouse there, or something.
Yeah.
You know, like it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We also dealt with it in D4 where they had a lot of resort communities around the lake, and then, the highway is winding through them. And did see a lot of crossing activity with people walking to the burger joint, to the ice cream. And it suddenly the highway was transformed into this, somewhat urban space. It was shocking to drivers.
Yeah.
And then we get into the more urbanized context types. So the first is the suburban setting. So you remember that slide that connected the AASHTO context categories to the MnDOT. We've sort of further broken them down. So we have suburban commercial and suburban residential. Suburban commercial, when I think about the context type, the biggest change between urban and suburban in my mind is what does the frontage of the building look like? Where's the parking? So in a suburban setting, you've all seen this, right? The parking's up front. You've got a big parking lot. It's very auto oriented. We're in an urban setting, the parking's around the corner, it's behind, it's on street, it's that kind of thing. And we'll look at urban in a minute here. But suburban commercial is a setting, which, you know, could apply to that small town Main Street, maybe not. You know, some pictures. This is very urban. Apologies in advance. A lot of my slides are urban because I work in urban areas a lot. And that's the pictures you got. So, but they could apply just as easily to more rural or greater Minnesota places as well. So that's Rosedale one. Suburban residential. So think about the difference between suburban residential versus urban residential. It's the same type of thing. What is the setback like? Where are the houses in relationship to the facility? You've got bigger yards. You've got where in an urban setting, you might have the houses tighter together, higher density.
Sometimes I like to look at the street network too. Suburban tends to be that swoopy, culverty sort of a network
Yeah.
versus urban, which tends to be the gridded network.
Yep.
And then similarly with commercial, where are the parking lots? The building in the urban commercial district, it's your main street, you know, your buildings are pretty close to the sidewalk, and then suburban, your parking lots out front. Show me all your cars in suburban.
Okay, industrial. So industrial is a unique one. In the NCHRP 855 report, industrial happened as a set aside. They kind of pulled it out and they said there are going to be unique context types that don't really fit anywhere else, and industrial was one of them. In Minnesota, we said it's different enough for us that we want to have a category for it. So it covers industrial, it covers like the intermodal terminals, it covers the ports, like if you're up in District 1, railroad centers, that kind of thing. But it's a different context and it's a different design when we get into transportation, right? So trucks, you can still have multimodal elements, and you often do, depending on where it is. But it's a different set of considerations that we get into industrial. And then we get into the urban, and there are 3 urban classifications. Urban commercial, and in my opinion, this is where most of the downtown Main Street type of streets fit, is in urban commercial. Buildings, you know, no setback, they're right up against the street. You've got a grid network. Parking is on street or, you know, behind in some sort of shared parking. You know, looks like that-ish, can look like that. Small town Main Street fits there. Apparently I was thinking that already. Urban residential, just like Sonia just said, you've got a transportation grid. You know, you've got higher density, houses are close together, setbacks are a little bit less, may or may not have multimodal shared use type facilities that you're wrestling with. And then the last one is urban core. This is your downtown. It's just like urban commercial or urban residential, but instead of like one corridor or 2 corridors, it's like a whole area, right? So you get the whole grid. And the Twin Cities are the obvious ones, but they're not the only ones. You know, Rochester, Duluth, probably St. Cloud. Maybe you know, you could have a debate about whether St. Germain is urban commercial or whether it's an urban core, and there are probably some others around as well. So those are the context types. And this is where we're going to start to transition and get into our activity. And we're going to ask you to do this. And Pamela's going to set that up in a minute. But before we do, just kind of a grab bag of best practices or guidance. And we've already talked about a lot of these, but you're never going to have a perfect corridor that fits cleanly into it. And that's why you have to use your judgment. You have to actually do the work. It's not intended to be like, I can go to the table and I identify the answer and now I've got my design guidance. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is say, this is what we think a baseline is, and let's go do the work and confirm that. You know, talk to people, talk to the locals, all that kind of thing. So that's what this is about. You have to work with the stakeholders. You have to go ask people. We get into some questions about land use. Is it existing or is it future planned land use? And the answer is yes. It's both, because we're building these as, you know, like generational facilities. We're doing a transportation project on the road, we're probably not gonna be back for 40, 50 years to do a complete reconstruct again. So we do have to consider future land use, but think about, how realistic is it? You know, I've seen in my town, I live in Richfield, future land use plans that essentially call for leveling a whole area, having a new urban utopia. It's like, no, I don't buy it. That's probably not gonna happen. So I'm not gonna plan for that, but maybe I talk to the city and they identify that that city-owned parcel actually is going to redevelop. We're gonna get, you know, new housing or something. Okay, well, that's more realistic. You have to use that judgment. You have to talk to people. So finally, remember, it's all about the users and activities. That's the whole point here, is to say, how does the land use influence the transportation design? That's the whole reason. This is a tool. It's easy to get into like really detailed debates, like I think it's this category, and I'm gonna split it up on, you know, split this block in half, and that's fine to do. But remember that your outcome isn't defining the land use categories. Your outcome is designing your transportation facility, which respects the activities generated or connected to those land use activities.